Angelicus and Equations here. Sperb.
Okay, well, hello everybody, and thank you for joining us for our 26th episode of Sperb Herbs. Today, a different thing again. We always do something a little different, and today we're going to be looking at Wu Gong, Scolopendra, or Centipede. So this is a very interesting quote-unquote herb. So let's get into it. Let's see what we have going on today. So today's episode, we're going to talk about an interesting herb in Chinese medicine. This is our first insect used for medicinal purposes. They do this a lot for Chinese medicine. This isn't the only one, but there are quite a few of them. So there we go. Not necessarily one of the most commonly used medicinals. It can be very useful in certain serious conditions. But before we get to that, let's talk some more about wind and specifically about internal wind, because that's what we're dealing with here with this herb or medicinal. So let's get going. Before we do, just want to remind you, we are sponsored by ourselves at this point. If you are an acupuncturist, this podcast as well as others are approved for California Acupuncture Board continuing education units and National Certification Commission of Acupuncture and Oriental Medicine professional development activities at a reasonable cost. Please check us out at www.integrativemedicinecouncil.org. That's council, C-O-U-N-C-I-L, integrativemedicinecouncil.org. I have also written a couple of books. First is Integrative Pharmacology, combining modern pharmacology with integrative medicine, which is actually usually I use as a reference in almost everything I do. So it's a very useful text and reference book. And my other book is Playing the Game, a step-by-step guide to accepting insurance as an acupuncturist. It's been a few years since I've written that, but it's still very relevant and still very useful for getting into billing for beginners and just to get you into that idea of billing insurance as an acupuncturist. Both of these are available at the shop on www.sperbersherbs.com. The name of the podcast, sperbersherbs.com, SPERBSHERBS. And I am your guide, as always, Dr. Greg Sperber. That's where the Sperb comes from. Let's talk about wind. So, wind. We have talked about the Chinese concept of wind in several of our shows so far, including episode 7 on warm the exterior herbs and 17 on cool the exterior herbs. Both of those took a look at external wind and how it can allow an external pathogen to invade into the body. And those herbs are those are the main herbs we use to deal with a cold or when an external pathogen enters the body. Today's medicinal deals with another type of wind, internal wind. So we consider that exterior wind or external wind, and now we're going to look at what happens, what causes and what is internal wind. So let's discuss this type of wind, what it is, what it does, and how we can treat it. So internal wind, or in Chinese, neifeng, is considered, again, this is my first time doing Chinese, so I should always warn people. I have studied many years of Chinese. I still suck at pronouncing it, so I apologize. The other thing is I'm going to be pronouncing Latin, where I've had even much less background in, so please be aware my pronunciations may not be exactly on target, but I try hard. So internal wind, or neifeng, is considered an internal pathogenic factor. So in Chinese medicine, we have these pathogenic factors, and there's not a whole bunch of them, and those are really, something that causes disease. So these are either internally generated or come from an external pathogenic factor transforming into an internal one as it penetrates into the interior of the body. So there's two ways we get neifeng, or internal wind. One is it's generated from within, and the other one is it's an external factor that was brought in and goes internal and then transforms into internal wind at that point. It sounds a little esoteric, but it really does make a lot of sense within the philosophy and worldview and context of Chinese medicine. A pathogenic factor, or Shei Qi, is a very broad term in Chinese medicine. It basically means anything that can cause a disease, and there's only a handful. There's about a dozen or so of various pathogenic factors. And typical internal pathogenic factors include phlegm, blood stasis, so when the blood isn't moving, and our topic of today, internal wind, of course. Internal wind. So as we get into the internal wind, the main manifestation of internal wind is involuntary movements. In fact, Giovanni Maccioscia, who was one of my teachers and colleagues, I worked next to him for many years, a really nice guy. He wrote kind of the foundational text in Chinese medicine, or one of the foundational texts in Chinese medicine in English. And so he said, if there is involuntary movements, always think wind. So you kind of put that on the opposite thing. Involuntary movements means wind, and in this case, really internal wind. So the main manifestations of these involuntary movements can include tremors, tics, and some similar symptoms such as severe dizziness, vertigo, and numbness. If you're looking at the difference between dizziness and vertigo, I've explored that difference for a lot of my career. In Chinese medicine, I was taught like dizziness is when you're spinning, and vertigo is when the room spins around you. When I got into Western medicine, no one had heard that distinction, so I don't think that's a valid distinction. But at least in Chinese medicine, I was told this. I haven't found it in writing that's the difference between dizziness and vertigo. But generally, in Western medicine, we just say dizziness and vertigo. We don't usually separate those two if we're going to do that. Numbness also is a cardinal sign of internal wind. In severe cases, there are convulsions. So again, convulsions, involuntary movements, that makes sense. Unconsciousness. I love this. Opisthotonos. Opisthotonos. There we go. This is generally considered a very serious sign. And what it is a spasm of the muscles causing backward arching of the head, neck, and spine. And in severe tetanus, some kinds of meningitis and strychnine poisoning can do this. So it's like this arching and you can't control it. And you've probably seen it where, someone's like, they usually do it like as they're giving paddles and the body arches up. That's opisthotonos. So that's what we're talking about if you've seen that in a movie or a TV show or something along those lines. Hemiplegia, which is the inability to move half of your body, and deviation of the mouth. So the mouth looks a little deviated. If some of these sound like they may be present in a cerebrovascular accident or stroke, cerebrovascular accident is the technical term for a stroke, that is because we consider internal wind to be a major component of a stroke. And a stroke in Chinese is called wind stroke or zhangfeng. And so that is very similar at the extreme levels of internal wind. If you have a lot of internal wind, it can cause a stroke according to Chinese medicine. Or vice versa, a stroke is caused by internal wind. While internal wind while internal wind can come from several different conditions, it is always related to liver disharmony. Now remember, in Chinese medicine, we have a whole bunch of different organs, and these organs kind of rule over certain aspects of the body. And so in this case, what we're talking about is liver involvement. And liver has a lot of very interesting functions, which I'm sure we'll get into at some point in one of our Sperb Zerbs, but we haven't yet. Extreme heat can cause liver wind. This occurs in the late stages of febrile diseases, febrile meaning feverish diseases, so high fever. Late stages of febrile diseases when the heat enters the blood and generates wind. So blood, we're going to find out, plays a big role in this wind, according to Chinese medicine. So signs and symptoms of this include high fever, delirium. Delirium is when you have an acute condition of not tracking, not being in reality. So it can include hallucinations and just wrong thoughts and things along those lines. Convulsion, coma. Here's that opisthotonos again, so that arching. A deep red tongue that is stiff and with a dry yellow coating, and a wiry and rapid pulse. So in Chinese medicine, we look at the tongue quite a bit. I like to call the tongue our CT scan. In Chinese medicine, by looking at the tongue, we can tell what's going on in the body. And we also take a feel of the pulse. The pulse is what I call our MRI scan of Chinese medicine. By feeling the pulse, we can tell what, again, even I feel in an even stronger way what's going on in the body. Though sometimes it's a little different, just like a CT is a little different than an MRI. And so we do the pulse. We take the pulse at 3 different positions on each hand at 3 different depths. So there's 18 different pulse positions, and we're looking for about 29 different pulse qualities as we're doing that. And when we get good at it, we can really tell a lot about what's going on in the body. And so this wiry pulse is something that is a very common sort of thing that we see when and it generally indicates pain or more often liver involvement. And so the liver is a big issue. So when you see liver, you often think about a wiry type pulse, and rapid indicates heat. And so in this case, that's the feverish that's going on here. So liver yang rising can cause liver wind in long-term cases. So that's one type of internal wind, was that febrile, the extreme heat causing liver wind. And now a different way you can get liver wind is through liver yang rising. And again, we've kind of talked around yin and yang. Think of yang as the rising heat, moving aspect of the body. Well, we're going to get into yin and yang soon. In fact, on our next episode, we're going to start talking about yin. And of course, you can't talk about yin without talking about yang a little bit. So we're going to start that process on our next episode. Hint, hint. So liver yang rising can cause liver wind in long-term cases. This can result in severe dizziness, vertigo, headache, tremors, tics, hypertension, dry throat, blurred vision, tinnitus, which is ringing in the ears, numbness and tingling, poor memory, and irritability. So the liver, we say the emotion of the liver is anger, so that will sometimes manifest as irritability. And you see there's a lot of stuff that's in the head, so dizziness, vertigo, headache, dry throat, blurred vision, tinnitus, which is the ears. All is in the head because liver yang rises, and it rises to the head, so that makes sense. And there are 3 main ways that liver yang rising can occur, either from liver yin vacuity, liver and kidney yin vacuity, or from liver blood vacuity. So we're going to get into all 3 of these different ways that this can happen. Liver yang rising from liver yin vacuity can also have signs and symptoms of dry eyes, in addition to what we just talked about, dry eyes, normal colored tongue with no coat, and a thin, wiry pulse. So liver yang rising from liver and kidney yin vacuity. By the way, the reason why liver yin is involved in liver yang, because we say that yin anchors the yang, it holds it down so that it doesn't float up, which is its natural tendency. So when you have a deficiency of yin, then the yang can float up, and that can then become liver yang rising if it's liver yin. That is deficient. And this word we're using, so liver yang rising from liver and kidney yin vacuity, this word vacuity is an interesting word because when I was in school, we always said deficiency, and then there's some standardization happen in the field, and some people agree with it and some people don't, so you still will hear deficiency quite a bit, but the more standard term is supposed to be vacuous or vacuity rather than deficiency. And I like that word. I think it's fine. I think deficiency, because I learned it first, means more to me, but I see the rationale for vacuity, so I try to use it. But they're often used into whatever you prefer. Though more technically at this point in our field, vacuity is probably a little bit more technically correct. So liver yang rising from liver and kidney yin vacuity can have similar symptoms with the addition of backache, because once the kidney's involved, we say that kidney deficiency can cause backache, so that makes sense. Scanny urination, because the kidneys are in control of urine production, and night sweats. So with the kidney involvement, we have a little bit more generalized yin deficiency, and one of the cardinal signs of yin deficiency is night sweats, so that makes sense as well. And then finally, the third way liver yang rising can occur is from liver blood vacuity. So the blood is there's not enough blood according to Chinese medicine. Again, if you're from a Western point of view, this may sound a little bit odd, but it makes sense from a Chinese medical point of view. And unfortunately, all I can tell you, having gone through this from a very Western background, even though I was learning martial arts and learning a lot of this stuff, going into Chinese medical school, there's all these really interesting concepts that don't make a ton of sense from a Western point of view. But what happens is, I just said, I'm just going to learn it. And I did. And it makes sense eventually. All the pieces kind of fit together. You just kind of have to trust that it will do that. And so it does. It just kind of, it makes a lot of sense once you have the big picture of Chinese medicine. But when we're just getting pieces, it sounds really weird and esoteric. So just bear with me with that stuff. So liver blood vacuity has the basic signs and symptoms of liver yang rising with the addition of insomnia. Blood deficiency can cause insomnia. A pale and thin tongue. There's not enough blood to make the tongue nice and red and full. And a thin, wiry pulse. So that it is, that wiry is that liver again. And thinness means there's not as much blood in it. So there you go. All right. And then finally, we have liver fire, stepping away from liver yang rising, causing liver wind. Now we get into another category. Liver fire can cause liver wind. So signs and symptoms of this include irritability. Again, that liver is irritable. Now, heat makes people irritable as well. So liver fire is like blazing heat. And so there's lots of irritability, including outbursts of anger, sudden onset of tinnitus or deafness. So like the fire flares up into the head, and so you lose your hearing. Red face and eyes, thirst. It's lots of heat, so you're thirsty. A bitter taste in the mouth is one. Dream disturbed sleep. Heat can disturb your sleep with dreams. Constipation with dry stool, so it dries out the stool, so you can't defecate as easily as you normally would. Dark yellow urine, concentrated because of the heat again. Nosebleeds. One of the things we see in Chinese medicine, heat can cause reckless blood, and so one of the ways you will see that is bruising, or in this case, nosebleeds. And also, we're seeing here spitting up of blood. So if you're coughing and you spit up a little bit of blood, something along those lines, or even vomiting blood. So any sort of reckless blood would be this. We would expect some of that potentially in this liver fire causing liver wind. And then the tongue is red with redder sides and a dry yellow coat. So red is obviously from the heat, and yellow is the color of heat. So a lot of things will be yellow when there's a lot of heat, and it's dry because all the fluids have been burnt off. And a wiry, again, that liver involvement, rapid pulse. Again, that rapid is heat. And we saw that before with the heat from the febrile disease causing this. This is even more heat than that, and it's slightly different, but it's in the ballpark of that. So similar. So vacuity of liver blood or yin can cause liver wind due to the deficiency of the blood, creating an empty space in the blood vessels, which is filled by internal wind. Now, of course, this isn't actually what's happening. It's a nice picture, though, isn't it? That if you have this blood deficiency in your vessels, there's space in the vessels, and it gets filled up with this internal wind. I mean, in a more modern sense, and both from a Chinese and from a Western point of view, I mean, you can think of this as sort of a coagulative issue. Like there's something going on with the coagulation of blood, and because often this sort of acuity can lead to that stroke that we were talking about later. So I think of it in those kind of terms, but I might be crossing a couple boundaries with the Chinese medicine bleeding into Western medicine, which I try not to do, though sometimes it can help me understand what's going on. So signs and symptoms of this condition include numbness, dizziness. So again, we're seeing similar signs and symptoms. Blurred vision, facial tics, slight tremors, not massive, but slight tremors. Poor memory. We say the blood stores the memory, especially the short-term memory. So if you have a blood deficiency, then you're going to have poor memory. Now, we said the vacuity of liver blood or yin. Now, they're on a continuum generally. So if you have blood deficiency and you don't treat it, it will eventually become yin deficiency. So that's why we're kind of combining these two a little bit, is that they're actually on a spectrum. So poor memory, insomnia, again, that blood deficiency can cause that. Scanty periods, you have to have enough blood to have a proper period. Pale, again, not enough red, not enough blood to put red in the tongue, and thin tongue, not enough blood to plump it up. And a thin, wiry pulse. Again, thin because there's not enough blood to fill the pulse, and wiry because it's liver related. So those are the main ways you can get internal wind. With the exception of the febrile diseases that we talked about first, internal wind is much more likely in the elderly. So for example, some of the manifestations of this could be Parkinson's disease. If you're not familiar with Parkinson's is the way it was said, it's now more proper to say Parkinson's disease rather than Parkinson's disease. And that involves trembles, with tremors of the hand, pill rolling tremors is what they call them. It's most common. And they have gait issues. It's called a fenestrated gait. So it's like a little bit shaky as they walk, and it's very specific, small, short steps, things along those lines. All those are manifestations of internal wind. So Parkinson's is a lot of internal wind. And of course, as we mentioned, wind stroke, which would be a CVA or a cerebrovascular accident or stroke in modern Western terms. And there's others, of course, that any kind of tremor, we're starting to think about what's going on with internal wind. So there you go. So treatment of internal wind is similar to other Chinese medical conditions, primarily acupuncture and herbs, though other modalities can be used. There are lots of other modalities. Again, we'll probably we talked about moxibustion as a modality on our episode when we talked about AIA. So that's one of the modalities that certainly can be very useful in treating this as well. And there's others. In the case of stroke or wind stroke, scalp acupuncture is often used. So I like to think of scalp acupuncture as kind of local acupuncture. It treats the brain. And if we look at the points in scalp acupuncture, right under those points are exactly the areas of the brains that would cover those things. So it makes a lot of sense. And so there you go. And all of this leads us to today's herb, which is used for internal wind, especially initial acute signs and symptoms of internal wind. So without further ado, let's get into Wu Gong. Wu Gong. So it's the second tone and the first tone of that, if you know Chinese. So okay, so Wu Gong, centipede is we're going to talk about the species in just a minute. It comes from the family Scolopendridae. Scolopendridae, which is very close to the species. So the genus here is Scolopendra. So the family is Scolopendridae. The genus is Scolopendra. And the species that we're actually talking about is Subspinipes. That's my best guess at how to pronounce that. Subspinipes. Might be Subspinipes, depending on how you do it. And specifically, they have the subspecies Mutilans L. Koch, K-O-C-H. And this very specific species is actually known as Shaoji Ju Wu Gong. So it's very specific, Shaoji Ju Wu Gong. Now we're going to find out there may not be any subspecies here. So this is an interesting thing. So keep this in mind as we go. So other species that can be sold and used as Wu Gong include Scolopendra subsnipes japonica, which is Ruben Ji Wu Gong. Scolopendra subsnipes mutidens, which is Duo Ji Ju Wu Gong. And Scolopendra dehani Ha Shi Wu Gong. Now, this last one is interesting because it takes us out of the subspinipes and into the dehani species. So that is a different species of Scolopendra. So, and again, it's not considered as strong as the subspinipes. So, all right. So the medicinal part of this is the whole insect. We're actually going to talk a little bit about what parts of the insect in just a little bit. The English translation of this is really just, it says here, shell mother from Sichuan. That is from a previous thing, so it's not actually this one. So the English translation really is Scolopendra. That is the English translation of Wu Gong is sort of Scolopendra. Other names for this include centipede, which we've mentioned. In Japanese, it's gosho. Again, I don't know how to pronounce gosho. Japanese or Korean, where it's ogong. In Chinese, some other names for this are baijiao, baizu zhong, tianlong, chizhu wu gong, chuanzu, baizu. And actually, we're going to talk about these actually mean slightly different things. It all refers to Wu Gong, but it actually means slightly different preparations and aspects of it. And we're going to talk about a lot of these as we go through this episode here. And finally, all the major sources that we looked at, I have three major sources that I look at. The first is Bensky and his team, Materia Medica, 3rd edition. And we have Chen and Chen, John Chen and Tina Chen, who wrote a really good book on Chinese herbs as well. So those two are really good. And I know John and I have met Tina. And then we have Brand and Wiseman. Eric Brand is a friend of mine. I've had lunch with him. He's a nice guy, really nice guy. And so that is called The Concise Materia Medica. It's a really nice book as well. So I use all three of those as sources, and you'll see them repeatedly used as sources here. And what's interesting is they often say different things or say the same thing in slightly different translations, and so we can kind of get a good, interesting idea of what's going on with them. What's interesting here is they all agree on the dosage. So that's not always the case. So it's interesting when we see such an agreement between all three books. So they say the dosage is 1 to 3 grams in decoctions, which are water extractions, boiling extractions, and 0.6 to 1 gram when powdered and swallowed directly. So in general, 1 to 3 grams is a low dose. Most of our herbs are in the 6 to 9 grams per dose category. So this is considered a lot less than our normal dosages, and that just reflects some of the concerns about this herb, which we're going to get into. So, okay. But first, let's talk about the family, the Scolopendridae family. And this is a family of large centipedes. These are large. Nearly all species in this family have 21 pairs of legs and 4 ocelli, or simple eyes, on each side of the head. Now, you're going to find out in just a few minutes that a good quality Wu Gong is going to have 22 sections, but I just said it has 21 pairs of legs. It's true, 21 pairs of legs and then the head. So that's the 22nd section. So that is 21 pairs of legs. Millipede, if you're not familiar, means 1,000 feet. So that makes sense, lots of legs. This genus Scolopendra, which is the genus that we're talking about here, has many species. They are venomous, they are predatory, they are basically meat eaters. I heard some of the things that they will attack mammals like mice, and will attack snakes. I mean, these guys are really vicious. The species Subspinipes, which again is what we're talking about, Wu Gong mostly, is currently not believed to have any subspecies, with most being elevated to their own species. So sometimes what I find in our herbal research and our herbal books is it lags a bit of like the cutting edge of the etymology of, you know, how everything is classified. And so it's not surprising to me that we will talk about subspecies when they may or may not exist anymore. But there are coloration differences, there are differences, and so those supposedly play a role in the effectiveness of this medicinal. So this Subspinipes species of Scolopendra can be as large as 20 centimeters, or about 8 inches. That's long. I mean, like if you woke up and saw this crawling on you, I don't know about you, I'd be freaking out a little bit. And they are venomous, so there's a good reason to be freaking out. Generally, they do not. The venom may hurt, but it doesn't really affect humans that much. There was one reported case that I came across of a 7-year-old girl who got bitten in the head, and she died from it. That was the only known case of dying from a millipede, from a Scolopendra bite. So here's the interesting thing. So up to 8 inches, and it can live 10 years or more. So these are actually really, for those who are interested in collecting such things, these are, I mean, 10 years. I mean, that's something to collect and have around for a while. So they're well sought after for that sort of thing. And the nice thing is, to get into it, but they are widely distributed around the world. We don't know if that's because they they came up around the world or whether they were introduced as invasive species in certain parts of the world, or lots of parts of the world. But you can find this in all over Asia, in southern United States, in the Caribbean, and other areas all over the place. So very widespread. All right, so what are these according to Chinese medicine? So the category that they're in, they're all all the books say something very similar, but with slight differences, I think, due to translational differences. But I think we learned something by going over some of these translational differences. So Bensky says, and his team says, it is a substance that extinguish wind and stop tremor. So there's that wind. And we didn't say internal wind, but that's really what we're talking about, and stop tremors. Chen and Chen say it's a liver calming. Makes sense. We said all wind affects the livers. Liver calming and wind extinguishing herb. And Brand and Wiseman say something very similar, saying it's a wind extinguishing, tetany relieving medicinal. So tetany is sort of it's a tight convulsion sort of thing. It's like your muscles are really massively clamped down, and so there's a tetany shaking to it. So that's tetany, which essentially appears like a tremor. So it's a more technical word for that. So it makes sense. So all those kind of say similar things, but slightly differently. Bensky et al. Says it's acrid, which means spicy, warm, so it's a warming herb, and toxic. It's a toxic herb. It makes sense that it has this venom. It could be toxic to humans. And so we have a bunch of herbs that we consider toxic. That's part of the reason why we have such a low dose for this herb. And we're going to get into, and one of the things that we're going to find that it treats is toxin. And we have this whole concept in Chinese medicine that toxin treats toxin. And so it makes sense that this might be a bit toxic. And it enters the liver. Of course, it makes perfect sense because everything we're talking about is liver. It's the only organ it enters. It's very specific, so liver. And Brandon Wiseman agrees completely with this assessment. And Chen Chen, however, doesn't say it is toxic in its attributes, but does later on describe it as such in a note. So I think they agree that it's toxic as well, even if they don't call it out as part of the attributes of it. So usually we talk about the tastes and properties of an herb. So the tastes include spicy or salty or bland or whatever it is. And then we have the properties, which include the temperature, so the warm and the cold and the neutral. And then we add in toxic when it needs to be in there, sort of thing. And it kind of falls into there. So again, Bensky and his team in Chen Chen both agree the original source of this herb is the Shendong Ben Sao Jing, or the Divine Husbandman's Classic of the Materia Medica from the 2nd century CE. And we talk about this a lot because a lot of herbs come from it. That is the first existing text on individual herbs. And so the fact that this is in that text means a lot because it means that it was one of the first herbs known, basically, or at least written about. There's, the herbs were known for probably 1,000 or 2,000 years at least before it was written down into this Divine Husbandman's Classic of the Materia Medica. But that is the first existing book we have on individual herbs. So what is good quality Wu Gong? According to Bensky, good quality is large, unfragmented, clean, with a red head and reddish brown legs. The ventral part, or the internal, the under part, should be dry and shriveled. Specimens with reddish brown legs are called red leg scolopendra or Churzu Wu Gong. Remember, that was one of the alternative names that we talked about earlier. Some say larger specimens are best. These are called large scolopendra or Da Wu Gong. Centipedes from Sichuan province are considered superior and are called Sichuan scolopendra or Chuan Wu Gong or Chuan Gong, or Sichuan legs or Chuanzu. So Zu means legs. Chuan, of course, is just a shortening of Sichuan sort of thing. So that's where Chuanzu comes from. Again, all these were kind of alternative names that we talked about already for Wu Gong, and here's what they mean. Zhao and Chen, which is a whole book really all about how to determine what is good quality and poor quality herbs. So they have an entry on this, and they say superior grade consists of dry, long strips that are intact with a black back and a yellow shrunken abdomen. They say there are 22 segments with a slightly fishy and distinctive unpleasant odor that irritates the nose. So if you've ever, we used to have in my school, and I used to work at the school for many years, a jar of this on the shelf, and when you'd open it up, you just get this whiff, and it would kind of irritate your nose a little bit. It was very interesting. So when I read that, I'm like, oh yeah, I know that smell. All right, so what are its Chinese medical actions? So according to Bensky, Wu Gong has several Chinese medical actions, including extinguishes wind and stops spasms and convulsions, attacks toxin and dissipates nodules, and unblocks the collaterals and stops pain. So these are all the different aspects of what we have here. So extinguishes wind, makes sense. It's part of that category. Stop spasm, again, part of that category. And convulsions, makes sense. Attacks toxin, again, that's that toxin attacking toxin sort of thing. So it can deal with toxins that go around. It dissipates nodules. So it actually can be used in skin conditions. We're going to see that coming up as well. So it can be applied topically for skin conditions as well. Unblocks the collaterals. So the collaterals are like, we talk about the 12 main meridians, or 14 if you consider Ren and Du, main meridians, and then collaterals are small little ones. Think of them as like we have our main arteries, and then we have little arteries coming off of those. Those are kind of the collaterals that we're talking about here in terms of qi and meridians. So that's what Bensky says. Chen is very similar. Instead of saying stopping spasms, it says stops tremors. Okay, I think that's exactly the same. It eliminates toxins rather than attacks toxins. It disperses toxic fire nodes, so it's a little bit more specific than dissipates nodules. That's under Bensky, but I still think it's all in the exact same thing. And opens channels rather than unblocks the collateral. So again, little changes based on translation issues, but I think generally it says the same thing. As we go into Brandon Wiseman, very similar. It says it extinguishes wind and checks tetany rather than stops spasms. It attacks toxins and disperses bind. So rather than saying dissipates nodule, it disperses bind. So a nodule is kind of a binding of qi, blood, phlegm, whatever it is. So makes it, again, that makes sense, just a slightly different view of it. And instead of saying unblocking the collaterals, it says frees the network vessels and relieves pain. So they all say it relieves pain, but how they kind of check these network vessels is probably a little bit more correct, more technical term than the collateral vessels. So it makes sense. They also state that there's an additional use for treating stubborn cases of medial or hemilateral, so one-sided, a headache, either standard headache or a migraine, and often with chuanxie or scorpion. So this is the first time we're talking about chuanxie scorpion. We're going to talk about it a lot. This is actually commonly talked with together with the centipede, so specific type of scorpion. So keep that in mind, chuanxie or scorpion. And Zhao and Chen, that book on quality, also has some uses, and it, again, very similar, almost exactly the same. In fact, it is the same as Brandon Wiseman, so I don't need to go over it. Instead of saying checks tetany, it says settles tetany in parentheses, convulsions. Other than that, it's exactly the same as what Brandon Wiseman just said. It's very similar. Okay, and then we have, as we mentioned, it was in the Shandong Ben Saojing of the Divine Farmers of Materia Medica, and I do have a translation of that, and this is what it says. It's really interesting what it says, because remember, the Divine Farmers is their first book, and it actually adds in a lot of what we call magic into Chinese medicine. I find this whole stream of things fascinating. It was up until like the 9th or 10th century CE, there was a whole division in the Imperial University of that was about magic in terms of Chinese medicine. So there's a lot of this magical thinking, not modern day, but back in the day. And so it says it is an inferior grade medicinal. So they will, this book classifies as inferior, middle, and superior grade. And inferior grade should only be used for short periods of time when necessary. So it makes perfect sense that a toxic herb would be considered an inferior grade medicinal. It is acronym warm, so it fits in with what we said earlier. It mainly treats demonic influx, goo toxin. So I'm not sure goo can mean ghost. I'm not sure this is the same goo. There's a lot of different words that have same pronunciation, especially without tone marks. I can't tell, and I don't have the actual character. So I don't know if this is the same character as a ghost, but gu does mean ghost. Gu also, I think, maybe a type of toxin as well. So I don't want to put that in there, but it makes a little bit of sense here. So treats demonic influx, gu toxins, and snake, worm, and fish toxins. So one of the uses for this is actually to treat a snake bite. So that's kind of an interesting aspect of it. It kills demonic matters. Interesting. So anything involving demons. Treats old essence. So again, that's the elderly. With essence is another of the vital substances. And so interesting. Treats old essence and warm malaria, and removes the 3 kinds of worms. So I guess if you have a parasitic worm infection, this would be a good herb for that. Again, this is old. This is not how it's used modern day, but I always love looking at how it was used originally. A modern footnote says it is a good medicinal for expelling wind, killing parasites, and inducing abortion. So that's an interesting thing, not found in the modern books, but something to think about. Western uses for this. While there are some very interesting scientific articles on research involving centipede venom, there were no obvious indications of its use as a useful medicinal by natural healers from the West. Again, that might be because it was not widespread, because it could have been introduced later on. I don't know. But also, I think Western herbalists and Western healers don't use animal products as often as Chinese and Asian healers will. We're going to talk a little bit more about its venom in a little bit, some of the specific sort of contents, but its venom consists of over 500 proteins and peptides, with the active components appearing to be neurotoxic, so they damage the nerves. The venom in our medicinal appears to act on ion channels to rapidly paralyze the subject. Again, us being as large as we are, it doesn't really affect us, but small animals it can certainly affect. All right. Let's talk about the commentary on this. So in Bensky's book, where a lot of this comes from, but also there's commentary in Chen Chen. Often in the monographs on these herbs, they will have like comments about how to use the herb and specific aspects of herbs. So the commentary in Bensky discusses some interesting aspects of this herb. And here's a quote: "By nature, it excels at traveling and piercing with a strong ability to track down wind and stop spasms and convulsions. It is thus an important substance for extinguishing wind and settling spasms in disorders such as childhood convulsions and deviation of the mouth and eyes due to wind stroke and tetanus. It also attacks toxicity and disperses clumping, and is thus used in the treatment of scrofula." So scrofula is nodules from tuberculosis, phlegm nodules, toxic sores, wind lichen simplex, which is a skin condition, and poisonous snake bite. It can be ingested or applied topically in these cases. It goes on and does a quote from the Grammateria Medica. They translate a quote from the Grammateria Medica and explains that it can control snakes. So it also can check wind. It is a medicinal substance of the leg terminal yin channel. That really is a complicated way of saying liver channel. Hence, the patterns it governs all belong to the leg terminal yin. Note that straight direction from Yang Ren Jai states, this is another quote within this quote, "Scolopendra Wu Gong is toxic and can only be used for violent, sudden wind qi. Wind qi that is violent and sudden cannot be easily stopped without the ability of Scolopendra Wu Gong to check and to capture it. This is the merit in matching illness and remedy. If the dose proves excessive, use Ferritima or Dilung, this is earthworm, and Mori cortex, Song Bai Pi, to resolve it." So if you do overdose it, here's the antidote. It's earthworm and Song Bai Pi, Mori cortex. So interesting. Right there it says how to deal with it. Their commentary translates another quote from a book. This book is Essays on Medicine, Esteeming the Chinese and Respecting the Western. So right there, you know this is a more modern Chinese text. It has the most rapid power to travel and pierce. Internally in the organs, externally in the channels and collaterals, Wherever there are places with congealed accumulation of qi and blood, it can unblock them. Its nature is particularly excellent for tracking down wind, internally treating the initial stages of stirred up liver wind or epilepsy. We haven't mentioned epilepsy, but epilepsy would be considered an internal wind scenario. Dizziness, cramps and spasms, or children's umbilical wind. I have no idea what children's umbilical wind is. Externally, it treats wind stroke in the channels and collaterals, causing deviated mouth or eye and numbness of the hands and feet. So that's some good commentary from Bensky and their team and translations. Chen and Chen says some texts suggest the head and tail are toxic and should be removed, while other texts say they have the strongest functions. They say research has found that using the whole insect is the strongest clinically, and therefore there is no need to remove the head or tail. So that is where we're at. Modern days is we do not remove the head or tail. All right, so that's the commentary. Let's step into preparations. There are lots of different preparations for this, for the Sperb. So traditionally, the insect is cleaned and dried and stretched on bamboo slats, and that's how you find it, is a thin, small slat with a big, long insect attached to it. In the past, the head was removed and legs were either removed or shortened. This preparation was referred to as Heavenly Dragon or Tianlong or 100 Legs Bai Zhu. Again, these are two alternatives that we talked about, names for Wu Gong already. This preparation is no longer necessary as the head and legs are considered effective, and the entire centipede is called complete scolopendra or Chuan Wu Gong. So this is interesting because both Chen and Bensky refer to the idea of, getting rid of the head and potentially tail or legs, and both say that no, that's not done. We found it's much better, stronger with the whole insect. Unprepared Wugong is considered toxic and should be used for the shortest amount of time possible and terminated as soon as there is a reduction in clinical signs and symptoms. Other preparations are possible. There's wine-prepared scolopendra or Zhou Zhi Wugong. Sections of the centipede with the head and legs removed are soaked in yellow rice wine, covered briefly as the wine is absorbed, then baked dry at a low temperature. This reduces toxicity and moderates its violent nature, so it is good for patients with weak constitutions. In longer-term consumption, this reduces the chance of poisoning and enhances its clumping, dispersing actions. So if you're using it for a slightly different purpose, then this is the way to use it. So if you're looking at those nodules, this might be a better way to do it a little bit more long-term too. Scolopendra head or Wugong toe. Traditionally, centipede head was considered a powerful intervention for tetanus with its rapid onset of severe symptoms. If you're not familiar with tetanus, this is we have tetanus shots as a vaccine, very deadly bug that's everywhere. And so if you cut yourself a bad cut, you get tetanus into your system and it can basically paralyze you. And so this is a potential treatment for that. You can imagine in the old days, it's nice to have a treatment for this. Because all of the ingredients are very toxic, this should only be used in this extreme type of excess toxic qi attacking internally. That's that scolopendra head or Wugong toe. Another preparation is scolopendra powder or Wugong mo. The centipede is dry fried or baked until yellow and crisp and ground into fine powder. It can be taken with water, made into pills, or applied topically, sometimes mixed with egg white or vinegar. Comparisons. So I told you we're going to compare. We're going to talk about scorpion, Scorpio chuanshe, and here we go. This herb can be compared with Bombyx batraticus, which is Baijiangsan or silkworm. So silkworm has similar functions, and Scorpio chuanshe, according to Bensky et al. All three are important for expelling wind and stopping spasms. Bombyx batraticus, Batricicatus by Jiang-san drains heat, expels wind, and transforms phlegm, while Scorpio chuanshe more strongly extinguishes wind and stops spasms. The Scorpio is more effective for tremors of the hands and feet, twitching, and torticollis. Torticollis is that stiff neck and you can't move it. Scolopendra Wugong is strong and violent in its action It is often used for opisthotonos, as we mentioned, convulsions and rigid spasms. All three can reduce swelling and disperse clumping. Baijiangsan tends to transform phlegm and disperse clumping to treat throat painful obstruction, while Chuanshe and Wu Gong both attack the toxin to disperse clumping and thus are used in the treatment of heat toxin sores or scrofula and phlegm nodules. Chen and Chen say both Wu Gong and Chuanshe both extinguish wind and arrest tremors. Wu Gong is stronger in these functions, as well as dispersing stagnation and dissipating toxic nodules, and is more frequently used externally. Chuanshe is neutral and better for twitching and tremors and is more frequently used internally. I think what the bottom line here with Chen and Chen is, if we're going to use Wu Gong internally, it should be for short periods of time. It's much more toxic. Brandon Wiseman compares Wu Gong with Sage tartarice, cornu, Lingyang Jiao, or antelope horn. Both treat fright wind and epilepsy with liver wind stirring internally. Yin-Yang Jiao treats the root and clears liver heat and stops liver wind. Wu Gong treats the tip and settles tetany to relieve the convulsions and not after the tetany has been resolved. So in other words, Wu Gong is treating the manifestation, while Yin-Yang Jiao is actually treating the disease, is really what we're talking about here. So that's interesting. Again, the use of horns and these things are, I think, in the West at least, not as common and are becoming less common with concerns about the use of animals and endangerment of species, things along those lines. I think antelope are far less. The other thing, the rhinoceros horn is, and I think was the other one that they use potentially, and those are endangered, so you can't use those anymore. So this is at least a good alternative to that, but I still would be hesitant to use antelope horn in this case. But all right, now combinations. There are some really nice combinations with this for very specific conditions, but the big combination is that Wu Gong and the Chuanshe, so that's scorpion again. So those are often combined. Both extinguish wind and powerfully relieve spasms. Chuanshe powerfully, that's the scorpion, powerfully extinguishes wind, while Wu Gong is more effective at tracking downwind. Okay, well that's an interesting terminology. I'm not sure exactly what that means. Both enter the liver and are mutually enhancing and very effective combination with a wide number of therapeutic uses, from high fever with seizures to epilepsy and swelling such as toxic swollen sores, scrofula, and enlarged lymph nodes. This combination can also treat stubborn migraines and pain from wind-damp painful obstruction. Wind-damp painful obstruction is sort of this rubric. It's painful obstruction B syndromes are these types of diseases that are called pain. But the wind-damp is often related to arthritis as we grow older, osteoarthritis, and potentially rheumatoid arthritis as well. So that's an interesting one. So can we treat, I have a question here, can we treat Parkinson's tremors, or is it too toxic? I think we can. I wouldn't use this alone in treating Parkinson's tremors. I'd be using it in a formula, and I probably would not use it long-term, or if I did use it long-term, I'd use it in a preparation that was not as toxic. So yeah, I wouldn't say this is not something we'd use in Parkinson's tremors. I just say we need to be a little circumspect about it. So yeah. All right, the contents of this medicinal, there's a lot of them. So according to Bensky, Wu Gong has a bunch of constituents, including toxic constituents of hemolytic proteins and a histamine derivative, other constituents of formic acid and delta hydroxycysteine. There's lots of fatty oils in it. I'm not going to list them. There's a bunch of them here, including cholesterol. And Chen adds hydroxylysine, taurine, chitin, chitosan, and glucosamine. So chitin and chitosan are going to be used in the shells of these, so that makes sense. Glucosamine, as you know, is good for joints, so that's an interesting one. There was a nice study by Hakim, Yang, and Lai from 2015 that found evidence that centipede venoms contain bioactive cysteine-rich peptides. So cysteine is an amino acid that builds up proteins. And several neurotoxins were discovered, including Mu SLPTX-SSM1A, which is a sodium channel blocker. So sodium channels are used a lot, and all of these channel blockers are used in nerves, so it makes sense. There's kappa, SLPTX, SSMA, SM1A again. Kappa, which has all the same except it's 2A, and another one that has 3A. They're all potassium channel blockers. The 1A also is a calcium channel blocker, while the 2A appears to be also appears to be a calcium channel blocker. So there you go. There's scolopin 1 and 2, both appear to be antimicrobial. So that's another constituents of these. And there are supposed to be some antimicrobial properties to this. Chen says it's used as an anti-neoplastic. So anti-neoplastic means anti-cancer. The study that they looked at was in vitro, which means it's not in humans, though there were some small studies that I came across, not strong enough for me to put in here, that did show some anti-cancer properties. So, I mean, there's some real good question as to whether this will help cancer or not, but I think it's an interesting line of research and more of it's happening. It can be used as an antibiotic, so it's good for bacteria. And I think I also saw some evidence of antifungal and antiviral, so it has antimicrobial sort of aspects to it. It also can be used as an anti-seizure medicinal as well, which makes a lot of sense based on its Chinese medical functions. So some studies showed usefulness in various skin disorders. This was interesting. It had an N of 600, which is a lot of people. It's from China, but there were all kinds of different skin disorders. So, I mean, there was a list of like 5 or 6 and more. So I don't know what skin disorders is particularly useful in, but there you go. Submandibular lymphadenitis, which is an enlargement and inflammation of the submandibular lymph nodes, the lymph nodes under your jaw. And this had an N of 226. Again, not a bad number of subjects. N equals number of subjects. It's not bad. And then there was one study that they quoted that said it was good for tuberculosis of the bone. But this only had an N of 10, which is a very small study. At least it's in humans, but not necessarily statistically significant with that small N. Drug-herb interactions. Several searches in scientific databases did not yield any obvious interactions with Wu Gong. In addition, several reference books, including the APA book, the American Herb Producers Association, they have a fantastic large book on the safety of herbs, and another one on herb and drug toxicities by Jens, did not include this medicinal. So I would say that's probably more, I have a feeling if there's more research done, we probably will come up with some drug-herb interactions, but the research hasn't been done because it's one of the more, it's much more obscure than most of the herbs in the thing. So that's, my guess is there probably are some drug-herb interactions. I'd be definitely looking at anticoagulants as a potential issue here, but there's no evidence of that at all, and nothing in the literature at all. So what are some concerns about this herb? So according to Bensky and his team, scolopendra is toxic. An overdosage may cause poisoning with such symptoms as nausea, vomiting, abdominal pain, diarrhea, fatigue, and general weakness. Yellow-colored sclera. Sclera is the white part of our eyes. It usually indicates that there's jaundice happening when you have yellow-colored sclera, so some liver issues. Disorientation, bradycardia or slow heartbeat, and shock. High doses can cause death from paralysis of the heart muscle and respiratory paralysis, so you can't breathe or pump blood. Poisoning is extremely rare, however, as the toxin is not heat resistant. Heating for 30 minutes at 100 degrees C or boiling temperature will destroy the toxin. So basically, if you decoct this, the toxins are probably destroyed for the most part. As a standard caution, they say the medicinal is toxic and should always be used with caution and never in large doses. And it is, for obvious reasons, contraindicated during pregnancy. Chen adds it's contraindicated in patients with blood deficiency or cases of chronic childhood convulsions. Now, that one I find interesting because it's supposed to be useful for childhood convulsions, but keep that in mind as you're using this herb. They add palpitations, dyspnea or trouble breathing, and unconsciousness to the signs and symptoms of overdosage. Those all make perfect sense given what it can do. Its use has been associated with tachyphylaxis. Tachyphylaxis is, it's not supposed to be tachyphylaxis there. It's supposed to be anaphylaxis. Sorry, different word. Anaphylaxis, what it should do is actually what it can cause is a serious allergic reaction. That's what we're talking about. So this can potentially cause an allergic reaction, serious allergic reaction. And that's it for this one. In our next exciting episode, we will be exploring another interesting category of herbs, nourish the yin herbs. We'll be explaining what yin is, and because you can't describe yin without describing yang, we will be looking at this complementary concept as well. After that, we will look at the herbs in this fascinating category, which has lots of implications for gynecological aspects as well as general health. Don't miss our next exciting episode, please. Thank you for being there with us. Appreciate it. If you remember, when you buy from Amazon, please use the banner ad on our homepage. We get a few pennies. I can't say I've had any pennies for a while now, so it'd be nice to have a little bit. If you like this podcast, please do us a favor. Give us a 5-star rating in your favorite podcast app. That would be fantastic, and we appreciate it. Thank you. And you can always get in touch with me at drgreg@sperbsherbs.com or at our website, www.sperbsherbs.com. And here's our bibliography. Again, thank you very much, and hope to see you again soon.
Sperb Herbs.
The proceeding was presented by Dr. Greg Sperber. We would like to thank Janelle for all her support and everybody else who contributed to this program.
Janelle.
Timothy
Thompson.
Dobbins.
Rogers.
Campbell.